December 13th, 1972. 11:47 in the morning, high in the Andes at an altitude of roughly 11,500 feet. A young man named Fernando Parado pressed a small transistor radio against his ear. The signal was weak. He had to hold very still. The voice from the speaker was calm and official. It reported that the search for Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 had been formally suspended. All 45 passengers and crew were presumed dead. Parado set the radio down. Around him, 16 people who were very much alive sat in silence. They had been listening too. This would become the moment everything changed. On October 12, 1972, a Fairchild FH-227 turboprop aircraft departed Montevideo, Uruguay, carrying 45 people. Most of them members of the Old Christians Rugby Club, along with their families and friends. They were flying to Santiago, Chile, for a match. The flight was routine, the mood was festive. Several of the passengers had never flown before. The Andes crossing required the aircraft to reach a cruising altitude high enough to clear the mountain peaks. Poor visibility that afternoon meant the pilots were navigating largely by instruments and estimated position. At some point, a miscalculation placed them over the mountains earlier than the instruments suggested. At 3:34 in the afternoon, the right wing clipped a ridge. The plane broke apart in the air. The fuselage, the main body of the aircraft, slid down a steep snow field and came to rest in a high valley at approximately 11,500 feet. Of the 45 people aboard, 12 were killed on impact or within the first hours. The survivors, mostly young men in their 20s, had no cold weather gear, no emergency supplies beyond what was on the plane, and no way to signal their location. The valley they had landed in was not on any flight path. It was surrounded on all sides by peaks exceeding 17,000 feet. There were no trees, no running water, no shelter except the broken fuselage itself. Fernando Parado was 22 years old. He had been unconscious for 3 days after impact. When he woke, his mother was dead. His sister Susie was alive, barely. She would die 9 days later, in his arms, of internal injuries. Roberto Canessa was 19, a first-year medical student. He became the closest thing the group had to a doctor, which, in the conditions they were facing, meant making decisions no 19-year-old should have to make. The others organized as best they could. They rationed the small amount of food from the plane: chocolate bars, wine, a few bags of peanuts. They melted snow for water by holding it in aluminum scraps against the sun. They slept huddled together inside the fuselage at night, where temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. On day 8, they picked up a radio transmission reporting that the search had been scaled back. On day 11, they heard it suspended entirely. The decision that followed, the one that would define the next 2 months, was not made by one person. It was made slowly, collectively, and with full awareness of what it meant. The food ran out on day 10. 33 people, 12 had already died, were sitting in a broken aircraft at 11,500 feet with no food, dropping temperatures, and the confirmed knowledge that no one was coming for them. What happened next is the part most accounts summarize in a single sentence and move past quickly. The survivors did not. They debated it for days. Some refused entirely. Some argued it was no different from surgery, that the body was no longer the person. One of them, a devout Catholic, reasoned that their dead friends would have wanted them to live. Eventually, the group made a collective decision to consume the flesh of those who had not survived the crash. It is worth pausing on what that actually meant. These were not strangers. They were teammates, schoolmates, in several cases, family members. Parado's mother was among the dead. He made his choice knowing that the ones who refused did not survive. By week 3, a new structure had formed inside the fuselage. Those who were physically strongest took on specific roles: melting water, maintaining the entrance, rationing what little remained. Canessa treated frostbite and injuries with whatever he could find in the wreckage: a pocket knife, strips of seat fabric, aluminum foil. On day 17, an avalanche buried the fuselage while most of the survivors were sleeping inside. The snow entered through every opening simultaneously. 8 people suffocated before the others could dig themselves out. The survivors used their hands. It took hours. When they finally broke through to the surface, they found themselves standing in complete darkness at altitude in the middle of the night, with 8 fewer people than they'd had that morning. They went back inside and waited for dawn. "What no one who wasn't there fully understands," Canessa said years later, "is that we never stopped believing we would get out. Even after the avalanche, even after the radio, we just didn't know how." That question, how, was about to become the only one that mattered. By day 40, 2 things had become clear. First, the group could survive indefinitely on the mountain as long as the food source held. Second, indefinitely was not a plan. No rescue was coming. The plane's location was unknown. Winter in the Andes does not end. It deepens. Someone had to go. The idea of sending an expedition out had existed almost from the beginning. Several attempts had already failed. The first group turned back after a few hours. The snow was too deep, the altitude too punishing, the cold too immediate. A second attempt reached a nearby tail section of the aircraft, which they had spotted in the distance. Inside, they found luggage, warmer clothing, and the plane's batteries. This was considered a significant victory. It was not enough. The fundamental problem was the mountains themselves. Looking out from the crash site in any direction, the survivors could see peaks. What they could not determine, because none of them were mountaineers, because they had no maps, because the aircraft had come down in a location that didn't correspond to any landmark they recognized, was which direction led toward Chile and which led deeper into Argentina. They had one partial clue. The pilots, in the final seconds before impact, had been descending. That suggested they believed they had already crossed the highest point of the range. Chile, therefore, should be to the west. West meant up. The peak directly to their west rose to approximately 17,000 feet. It had no name that any of them knew. It was simply the wall between them and survival. And in October and November, with winter conditions still holding, it was impassable. Parado believed otherwise. He had become, in the weeks since the crash, a different person than the one who had boarded the plane in Montevideo. He did not explain this change in terms of courage or determination. He explained it in simpler terms. His mother was dead. His sister was dead. He had nothing left to lose that he hadn't already lost. Fear, he said, had simply stopped working on him. He chose Canessa as his partner. Canessa had a different relationship with the plan. He was not fearless. He was terrified, and said so openly. He spent 2 weeks after the decision was made, finding reasons to delay. The weather, the cold, his own exhaustion, the group, growing impatient, began to pressure him. At one point, the other survivors voted on which 2 people should go, weighing physical condition, mental state, and the probability of survival. Parado and Canessa were the consensus. That is when the other vote happened. The vote no account of this story lingers on. With food becoming scarce again, and no departure date confirmed, the group held a discussion about resource allocation. If someone was severely injured and unlikely to survive the coming weeks regardless, did it make sense to continue their full share of food? The discussion did not reach a formal conclusion. But it happened, and everyone in that fuselage understood what was being considered. Canessa announced they would leave in 3 days. They prepared as methodically as men with almost nothing can prepare. They fashioned sleeping bags from insulation torn from the aircraft walls. They made snowshoes from seat cushions. They packed as much food as they could carry, which was not much. They calculated that they had, at most, 10 days of supplies. On December 12, 1972, day 61, Parado and Canessa left the fuselage before dawn and began climbing west. The others watched them go. No one spoke. What the two men didn't realize was that the mountain in front of them was significantly larger than it appeared from the valley floor. The first day, they gained perhaps 2,000 feet of elevation. It nearly killed them. At altitude, the body burns calories at a rate that has no equivalent in ordinary life. Every step in deep snow requires full engagement of every muscle. The air contains roughly half the oxygen available at sea level. Canessa, who had been tracking the group's physical deterioration for weeks with a medical student's eye, knew exactly what was happening to their bodies as they climbed. He chose not to share this information with Parado. They camped on the open snowfield that first night, inside their improvised sleeping bags, with the temperature dropping below -20. The bags held. Barely. On day 2, they reached what they believed was the summit. It was not the summit. What they had reached was a false crest, a ridge that, once topped, revealed another slope rising beyond it. And beyond that, in the distance, another. The mountain did not end. It extended range after range in every direction as far as either man could see. Canessa sat down in the snow. He had a choice. Turn back, return to the fuselage with the information that the route was impassable, that the mountain was too large, that they had been wrong about the direction. The group would understand. Some would even be relieved. Or continue. He stood up. They kept climbing. On day 3, they reached the actual summit, 17,000 feet. From there, for the first time, they could see what lay to the west. Not the flat green valleys of Chile they had imagined. More mountains. Dozens of them, range after range, extending to the horizon. And far below, barely visible, what might have been a thin brown line running through a distant valley. A road. Parado later said he felt nothing in that moment. Not relief, not hope. He simply noted the direction and began descending. The descent was, in several ways, more dangerous than the climb. On the western face, the snow was different, crusted and unstable, prone to shifting without warning. Both men fell multiple times. Canessa tore open the palm of his hand on an exposed rock. They wrapped it with fabric and kept moving. By day 7, they had descended into a narrow river valley. The snow had given way to rock and scrub grass. The temperature was survivable without the sleeping bags. They found a stream and drank from it, the first running water either man had tasted in over 2 months. They also found something else. 3 small cairns, stacked stones, on the riverbank. Recent ones. Someone had been here. They followed the river. On day 8, across the river, they saw a man on horseback. The man saw them. He stopped. He stared at 2 figures who looked, by all accounts, like something between survivors and ghosts. Emaciated, sunburned to the point of rawness, dressed in a combination of rugby gear and torn aircraft insulation. The man shouted something across the water. The river was too loud. Neither Parado nor Canessa could hear him. Parado found a piece of paper and a pen in his pocket. He had carried them from the crash site for 69 days without knowing why. He wrote a single sentence in Spanish and threw it across the river, wrapped around a stone. "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan." The horseman read it. He looked up at the 2 men on the opposite bank. Then he turned his horse and rode away. They didn't know if he would come back. They had no food left. They had no way to cross the river. They sat down on the bank and waited. The horseman came back the following morning. He brought bread and cheese and tied a note to a stone and threw it across the river. The note said, help was coming. Parado and Canessa ate the bread slowly, in small pieces, the way Canessa had instructed. After this long without real food, eating too quickly could kill them. On December 22, 1972, Day 72, Chilean search and rescue helicopters located the two men in the valley. That same day, a separate team was directed to the crash site in the Andes, using the coordinates Parado had provided. The helicopters could not land at 11,500 feet in a single trip. The altitude and thin air limited what each aircraft could carry. The 14 survivors still at the crash site. They had lost one more man in the weeks since Parado and Canessa had left. Were evacuated in 2 separate runs over 2 days. When the first helicopter set down in the valley near the fuselage, the pilot stepped out and looked at the men waiting for him. He had been told there might be survivors. He had not been told what survival at that altitude for that duration actually looked like. He said nothing. He helped them board. All 16 survivors made it out alive. The story that emerged in the weeks following the rescue divided the world along lines that had less to do with the facts than with what people were prepared to accept. The survivors held a press conference in Montevideo and stated plainly what they had done to stay alive. Some were condemned, some were celebrated. The Catholic Church, after consideration, issued a statement that stopped short of condemnation. The detail that received the least attention then, and still receives less than it deserves, was not the cannibalism. It was the radio. On day 8, the survivors had picked up a broadcast reporting that the search was being scaled back due to the terrain and weather conditions. On day 11, they heard the official announcement that it had been suspended entirely. They had heard themselves declared dead. Parado described sitting with the radio afterward. Not crying, not panicking, simply recalibrating. If no one was coming, then they were going to have to leave. The announcement that should have destroyed them had, in a way, clarified everything. Canessa put it differently. The moment they told us we were dead, he said years later, was the moment we decided to survive. There is one more detail the popular version of this story consistently omits. When rescuers reached the crash site and began the formal documentation of what they found, they attempted to calculate how many days the group could have continued surviving on the mountain. Based on remaining food sources and the physical condition of the men they recovered. Their estimate, approximately 8 more days. Parado and Canessa had left on day 61. If they had delayed by 2 weeks, if Canessa's hesitation had won, if the weather had held them back, if the second vote had gone differently, the rescuers would have arrived to find no one alive. The margin was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was 8 days. 16 men walked onto that plain in Montevideo in October 1972. 16 men came home in December. What happened in between is remembered as a story about cannibalism, about survival, about the limits of the human body. That is not wrong. But at its core, this is a story about a 19-year-old who was terrified and went anyway, and a 22-year-old who had already lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to fear. That combination, on that mountain, in those 8 days of margin, was the difference. Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa both returned to Uruguay. Canessa completed his medical degree and became a pediatric cardiologist. Parado became a television presenter and businessman. Both have spoken publicly about the experience for over 50 years. Neither man has ever said the mountain made them stronger. What they say, consistently, is simpler than that. They say it showed them what was already there. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to leave it in the comments below. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully, I will see you in the next one.